All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for bearing with us. A couple of technical issues we're dealing with here. Travis Porter, our guest speaker with the Department of Ecology. He's also on the line, is going to be answering questions, but he's having some issues with his webcam. So we're going to leave that off for this webinar. But today's Coffee and Compliance, really excited to have you all here to talk about the Washington Industrial Stormwater Permit and some of the emerging trends and things to think about, both in Washington, but more broadly across the US, especially around emerging contaminants. Thank you very much for being here today, Travis. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing a little bit about the perspective from Washington. I guess to kick things off, do you want to give a little bit of background in your role as leading the Industrial Stormwater Program?
Sure, yeah. I'm the Industrial Stormwater General Permit writer. I've been with Ecology over 5 years now, which is kind of hard to believe. I serve as sort of the technical lead for source control. So the stormwater management manuals, the source control chapters of those are sort of my wheelhouse. Lead the implementation team for statewide implementation of the industrial permit, and also am sort of the team lead for the general permit writers. So I've also somehow got my hands on other permits, such as the CAPO permit, boatyard, winery, helping those permit writers with some of those issues. But my main focus and sort of what I'm trying to get back to doing is just industrial stormwater.
Yeah, so it sounds like your first love is it being in the industrial stormwater program, not all the other permits.
I like the other permits. I just don't know enough about them or their history to really. I know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to really do much good.
Yeah. Do you see a lot of overlap between the other permits and the industrial stormwater program? Do you borrow kind of core items from each permit?
Sometimes, yes. The boatyard, sand and gravel, and winery permits well, the winery not so much, but the boatyard and sand and gravel were sort of spin-offs from the industrial stormwater permit, because those two had a process water component to them, and so they spun those out and did a general permit for that encompassed both stormwater and the process water. So there is a bit of overlap there. We do share a little bit with the muni permits, but that's a whole different basically chapter of CFR, so we don't get too crazy with the overlap there. But a lot of the general conditions are general conditions for all NPDES permits, be it a general permit or an individual permit. So there is quite a bit of overlap.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially with like it being a commercial operation that's a discharger in all those scenarios versus like the municipal side, which is a very different dynamic and organization. One of the questions to kick things off that I had to send over to you is just like the current permit's not scheduled to be, till the end of 2024. Do you foresee any changes or amendments to that permit between now and the next permit cycle?
No, and thankfully, when the appeal is still sort of going on, I haven't gotten all the motions to dismiss yet. So there's still that unknown factor that something could still end up in front of the board. But I believe we have settlements signed with all the parties for all of the issues. And part of that was, we will add the language the next time we issue the permit, unless the board requires us to modify it. And since none of the issues went to the board, we didn't have to modify the permit. And so those proposed changes will be in the next permit. And the main reason we did that was these settlement agreements basically were just signed. I think the last one was just signed a month ago. And we are already starting to plan the reissuance of the 24 permit, because the ISGP is such a big permit with such massive outreach that it's on a 2-year renewal schedule. So basically starting January 1, I'm going to be in renewal phase on this permit, starting the outreach. And so it didn't make a lot of sense to modify it now when we're going to be going right back out to modify it here shortly.
What do you anticipate being the biggest changes for dischargers in the next permit cycle?
The big thing will be timelines around corrective actions. In the past, it was basically, you trigger level 2 or 3, you have until end of August, end of September the next year to get that done, unless you submit a time extension request or a waiver request by May 15th. Part of the settlement was we started looking at language and then thinking about especially the big engineered systems, and not necessarily big, but the tricky engineering systems where sites have engineering involved that's very site specific. There's back and forth between the permittees engineers and Ecology's engineers. Go ahead and granting them basically a 1-year time extension just off the bat. So instead of, you trigger that corrective action year 0, you have to have it done by year 1. If you're doing that engineering, we're going to extend that out to be done by year 2, and then not require, the extension and waiver stuff due by May 15th. We'll let that be due up until, your timeline. So that way, you don't have to completely have a crystal ball to look forward and say, okay, yeah, we're going to run into issues. We need time. If you can get it done, you get it done. If not, and you're coming up on that deadline, you're like, oh crap, we're missing supplies, or pandemic happened and things are shutting down again. Then you can submit that at any time, and we can get that approved or denied based on the technical basis or whatever. And that, I think, will be the biggest thing. I think it's going to be beneficial to permittees because it's going to give them that additional time if they're doing the engineered stuff, not so much on the off-the-shelf stuff. It'll free them up so they're not scrambling in May to try to put together a time extension request if they don't even need it. And I think it's going to help us in the long run, because when these things come in May, it really does back us up and slams us to the point where I've got, like this year, I think I did 23 orders that I had to write, which takes a lot of time away from doing other things in that May, June, July timeframe. So that's going to be the biggest one. The other big one will be the automatic approvals for CNEs are going away. So when you apply in the past, it was if you didn't hear from us in so long, then it was automatically granted. Here, there's got to be a definitive answer from Ecology, and that was based on the settlement agreement. Those are going to be the 2 biggest proposed changes in the 2024 permit. Just because we agreed to put that language in there doesn't mean it's going to stick. It's still got to go through the public comment period, so bear that in mind. That's just what we propose to do for the settlements. Yeah. But those will be the 2 big changes coming in that permittees, I think, are really going to pick up on.
Yeah. What's been the general kind of status with permittees today under the current permit? Is there anything that really stands out that's going well, or on the flip side that permittees are struggling with under the current permit?
Overall, I think compliance is going fairly well. The ISGP has probably one of the highest DMR submittal compliance rates. I think we're sitting around 90 to 95% of those are submitted, which is good. We still have a couple that are lagging behind, and we're bumping up enforcement on that. Our annual report compliance is a little less than that, but again, that's coming up. And one thing that's going to help with that is our IT department is launching sort of this pilot program, and the ISGP gets to be the lucky permittee. Paris will send automatic reminders for DMR submittals if they're not submitted on time. So I think that's going to help keep the compliance up on that front.
Yeah.
As far as corrective actions, we've had just in 2022, we had 166 sites out of just shy of 1,200 permittees trigger a level 2 or 3. Of those 166 sites, we had 25 requests come in for time extension. So I'd say, thinking in that realm, we're doing fairly good on the compliance front with the corrective actions. I think most people have at least some form of treatment or source control in place that's keeping them out of that level 2 or 3 time and time again.
Yeah, do you see the DMR submittals as being one of the biggest challenges still? Just getting them in on time and remembering?
Yeah, that and annual reports. And I think probably more so annual reports, because that once a year. It tends to get forgotten about, whereas the DMRs, they're doing them quarterly. And I think most of our permittees have been around long enough that they know that, if they don't submit that DMR, then somebody's going to come knocking and find out. But I think, the DMRs, I think the last enforcement meeting we had, we were only sending out, I think, 7 penalties. And those were for the very, we hadn't seen a DMR from them in 2 years or longer. But like I said, we're sitting at like a 95% compliance rate, which out of 1,200 permittees is really good.
Yeah, that's awesome. What do you think that's due to? Is it just time that people have gotten used to it? Is it enforcement strategies, outreach strategies? What do you think's driving that?
I think it's familiarity with the permit. The ISGP doesn't have a lot of turnover on its permittees, so most of our permittees have had this permit now. If they've been in business since 2009, they've had this permit since 2009. And I think that really helps. They've been through this long enough to know, the ins and outs, versus something like the construction permit where you might be getting some fly-by-night companies coming in who have never done, had no idea what to do, and then, don't even know what a DMR is. I think the ISGP permittees have been around long enough to know the ins and outs and just have that basic familiarity of what it is, what's due, and what's required of them.
Yeah. When you said the enforcement meeting, you were saying 7 penalties. What's the time period on that for the DMRs that you're enforcing against? Is that a quarterly thing, a monthly thing?
That one, I think we just went back 2 years, and I don't exactly know why they picked that, but I think what had happened was initially we just looked back at the last year. We tried to send out the reminder letters, and I think the new reminder email will go a lot further to get that sort of immediate response. But look back a year and find out who didn't give us a DMR, and then once we started looking at that year-long list, and then sending out phone calls and reminders to get those DMRs in, basically everybody complied except for a small handful, and then we started looking at them closer and realized we hadn't gotten anything from them over 2 years time frame. And so that at that point we went back and looked, okay, yeah, we tried this, we tried that, we've sent numerous letters, certified mail, the whole 9 yards. We've tried everything we could. Now it's down to the enforcement side of things, which we don't like to go that way if we can help it, but sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah. On the DMR side, and even you mentioned Paris earlier, what do you anticipate, or if anything, changing from public access to records like that via Paris and online? Any other projects besides the reminders on the data side?
Not really. I think that's the big one, especially for our permittees. From what I could tell, and I'm no IT expert, but just listening to the IT folks discuss, there has been progress made on the data flow to EPA's the ISIS system. In the past, for some reason, EPA's database did not match Paris, and EPA was like, "Oh, you've got all these non-compliances," and we're like, "No, we don't, because it's showing up right in Paris." And there's something going on between the data flow between Paris and ISIS. And from what I gathered, last I heard, which was 2 weeks ago, that has been completely fixed, and they've resent all the data over to EPA. So now EPA's compliance data should match Paris data.
Yeah. That was a concern for some dischargers, is that what was showing publicly in, ultimately in ISIS or ECHO that it wasn't correct, and maybe it's because of this data flow issue.
Yeah, and that's always been our biggest, kind of one of the biggest issues we've dealt with is answering that question of, we're in compliance, but EPA says we're not, or, third party saying, well, they're out of compliance, but Paris says they're in compliance because they are. And we've always held that, because of that issue, Paris is always going to be the place of record for compliance for Washington facilities. So just because EPA shows you out, if Paris shows you in compliance, then you're in compliance.
Yeah. How often does that come up where you get those kind of like inquiries either from other, either EPA or third-party groups saying that EPA shows a facility out of compliance, but Paris is showing it as in compliance?
It's not too frequent, but it does pop up every now and again. Typically, I think luckily here, most third parties know not to look at EPA's data. They instead look directly at the Paris because they know that issues have been going on. So I don't get that call from them so much. The one I do get from is generally EPA. Anytime they decide to do some sort of regional inspection or enforcement, they come up and they're like, well, our stuff shows this, and I can point to Paris and say, well, that's wrong.
Yeah.
But I think in the last few years, I've only, really had to deal with that on the EPA front about 6 or 7 times. The other one was like national companies who automatically look to EPA and go, well, this is saying we're wrong, but you're saying we're in compliance, so which is right? And it's just, their own internal people not knowing that Washington has its own database.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's been so much at the EPA level from a data standpoint of getting more and making it more public that I think a lot more people are looking at it. Like we looked at the trends of like just the facility databases on the EPA side, and the user rate is skyrocketed. So I think there's more people looking at it overall, just whether it's in Washington or elsewhere. Switching topics a little bit, we were talking before we jumped on this webinar about emerging contaminants. Can you share a little bit around what's kind of the current status in Washington on emerging contaminants? PFAS, PFOAs, always a hot topic, but I know you mentioned some others that are coming out and how to address them. If you can kind of lay out how you guys are thinking about it and dealing with it.
Yeah, I'd say that right now the biggest one that's sort of on our minds is the 6-ppd quinone, which for the longest time, we knew, stormwater runoff was causing mortality in juvenile coho salmon, but we never really understood which compound or which set of compounds was really sort of that toxic driver there. And it was, basically just discovered either late last year or early this year. I can't remember. I mean, it happened sometime during COVID, but it was basically found that it was the 6-ppd, which is actually a chemical that's in tires, and it's used to sort of stabilize the rubber and prevent, that weathering breakdown. So anytime you drive, your tires are starting to flex. That 6-ppd is starting to migrate towards the outside of your tire, so it helps that rubber stay flexible. What that means is we at least know what's causing it. And we know that it doesn't take much for that to become toxic towards the salmon. With that being an emerging concern, we know what it is, we know how to test for it. There is work, I believe, on our toxics reduction group with tire manufacturers to start thinking about what we can do to help prevent that. And they're certainly open to that discussion as well, because they don't want to be fully responsible either. But what that means for permittees, and not just the industrial permit, this is going to impact industrial, municipal, sand and gravel. It's going to have its hand, I think, on every single permit, is how we're going to keep 6-ppd out of the water. And it's going to boil down to more than likely increased source control and treatment. Early studies have shown that not all treatment is really doing everything. And this, it's been a bit since I've been in there, but if I remember correctly, something like retention has an issue with the 6-ppd basically compounding itself, whereas the more active treatment where it's not retention, where there's no retention, it's basically forced through and filtered out, we don't see that getting compounded. But that's still very early. We do have a person at Ecology who's dedicated to pollutants of emergency concern, and we're also got money to hire a 6-ppd person who I believe will be mostly municipal focused, because of the roadway issue, but they're also going to have overlap with this permit as well. And they're going to help sort of filter through the data to figure out treatment and source control BMPs for 6-ppd. What that's going to mean for industrial permittees is I don't know if it's going to go in the next permit or not. There's certainly a lot of pressure from the public and the tribes. The tribes are basically, now that we've narrowed it down to that, saying that all the mortality is now considered take for their treaty agreements. So we've got pressure from Fish and Wildlife and the tribes to basically figure this out and get this to stop. But we've got to come up with that treatment. How are we going to keep this stuff and keep this out and make that feasible for everybody? And I think what it's going to boil down to is once we get that figured out, that's going to sort of set the standard for a cart.
Yeah. Do you have an idea of what kind of levels you're going to be testing to? Given that you mentioned that you have a way of measuring it, but do you already have an idea of what those levels will be?
I honestly don't, and I don't know what the if it's going to be based benchmark limit or technology based. My initial hunch is it's going to be technology based, solely based on the fact that so little of this, a tiny bit of it basically is toxic. I don't even know if we can measure down to that level. So I think what we're going to be looking for are non-detects across the board if it goes that far. But again, I'm not sure. We're still in that super early phase. They just started doing their big, sort of research push this year. I'm expecting to see sort of that first round of data from that probably coming up later this winter, next spring sometime. And that's going to detail what path we start going forward on the permitting side.
Yeah, and that's from that internal, the scientists or researchers internal to Ecology that are focused on this issue. That's that research.
Yeah, they're the ones that are really at this point looking at how do we treat this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think with the labs and stuff, now that we know what it is, there's not a direct method. I'm not sure what that method is. I'd have to actually go in and look at the method to see what the minimum detection limits are for that. But like I said, with what they're finding, it seems like an awful, just a tiny bit of this stuff is fairly toxic. So it's probably going to come down to a technology limit to where if we know a treatment's going to work, that's what's going to have to be there.
Yeah. And you anticipate almost a non-detect level for a benchmark or a technology?
I would, at this time, I would assume so, unless they come back with, it's not as bad as we thought. We can get this level and still be okay. Then it will be a water-based limit based on that number. But
yeah,
from initial gut reaction on my end is just based on what I'm hearing. It's probably going to be technology based on non-detect.
Okay. Are there any other emerging contaminants that you see or new parameters getting pulled into the permit or significant changes in benchmarks or limits?
Not necessarily. There's still the PFAS that's out there, but we're not seeing a ton of that industrial stormwater. The big focus for that one with stormwater will be, basically around areas where the aircraft firefighting foam, the AFFF, is found. When I worked for the military, when this all came out, at the time there was no mil spec AFFF that didn't have it in it. I don't know if that's changed or not, but certainly those are the areas that are going to have the biggest concentration of this. So airports, airplane hangars, those sort of things are likely to have it, but we're not seeing it unless they really use it. Other concerns, as far as the next permit, I haven't seen anything come out. We haven't really even begun to delve into the DMR data just yet. I've got it all downloaded. It just needs to be sorted and processed for the next permit cycle. But I'm not at this time anticipating any additional parameters for any of the groups, unless I've got good reason from others involved in this to start adding additional, but certainly nothing's come out. There likely will be expansion on the sediment cleanup sites just because the sediment team is always out. They've got numerous sites they've been working on, and we do need to make sure we're not recontaminating areas where we just spent a bunch of money to fix up. So for the facilities on Puget Sound, if there was a cleanup right off your facility there or in that waterway, chances are you're going to end up in that sediment cleanup site where TSS and drain solids are going to be a concern for you as well. I think the last time I talked to the sediment folks, there was only 1 or 2 additional sites that may be included. I'm not sure just yet because I haven't seen those maps. But for right now, I'm planning on leaving everything the same. I do need to go into the water quality atlas and start looking at the water quality standards again and double checking all of our numbers. Last I've heard, they haven't changed, so I don't think anything else is going to change.
Okay, no, that's good to know. So keep tracking on the 6 ppd, as a potential, but everything else should be pretty similar to what it is today.
Yeah.
Cool. What's the best way, as we wrap things up, what's the best way for people to reach out to you or get engaged with the public process?
The best thing is email, and it's just travis.porter@eci.wa.gov. Since we are teleworking mostly now, that's the best way. There is the I want to listserv, even though it's not listserv anymore. You can sign up on the industrial stormwater webpage. And we try to do a pretty good job of updating that webpage as we start getting into public outreach timeframes. So coming up in the next probably 5 months or so, you're going to see that the ISGP webpage updated with probably some additional dates and things like that. There is a new listserv as well. Pardon me, and I know listserv is not the right name. I'm severely dating myself at this point. For the stormwater management manuals that also have a tie-in, they are getting updated earlier, thankfully, than last time. Last time we ran into issues with them being updated at the same time we were trying to do a permit. So those should be getting here very soon. And there is a new listserv for that. And I think if you sign up for the industrial, you have that option to also be included in that one as well.
Okay. No, I appreciate all the resources. We've got to wrap up now as we hit the 8:30 mark. Travis, thank you very much for jumping on again and sharing the current status in Washington on the industrial general permit. And we'll keep an eye out for when the draft comes out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no worries.
Have a good one. Thank you all.
Thank you.